For nearly 2 decades, I believed I had what many women secretly wish for: a stable home, a reliable husband, children who thrived, and a life that, at least, people who saw us from the outside often said, "What a perfect couple." Wah, my husband Mark wore that illusion well. He was charming at dinner parties, good with a toast, always quick with a story tea. He was the kind of man who looked like he had life figure. And I played the role of the steady wife. I kept the house running, raised the children, worked part-time to supplement our income, and made sure that bills were paid on time. From the very beginning, Mark insisted on one thing: financial control. "Let me handle the money," he said after our wedding when I hesitated about merging our accounts. "It'll be simpler this way. One household, one account, one strategy." At first, it sounded reasonable. After all, marriage was about trust, wasn't it? We were taught that in church, in novels, in whispered advice from older women. Pick a man you can trust, then let him lead. And I trusted Mark, so I handed over my paychecks. I let him manage the joint account. And when I asked questions, he brushed them off with a smile. "Don't worry, I've got it covered." It became a refrain in our marriage. Don't worry, don't trouble yourself, don't ask too many questions. And for years, I listened. Like many women of my generation, I told myself it was fine to set aside my ambitions. I had dreamed of opening a financial consultancy for women, something small but empowering. I wanted to help wives and single mothers understand credit, mortgages, investments. But when our daughter Emily was born, Mark persuaded me to wait. "Focus on Emily now," he said. "Your dream can wait." So I put it off. When our son Jacob came along 3 years later, I put it off again. Each season of life seemed to ask me to postpone my own voice a little longer. Mark, meanwhile, pursued opportunities. He dabbled in real estate, tried his hand at consulting, invested in a friend's restaurant. Not all of it worked out. Some of it, in fact, failed spectacularly. But I carried the family's stability by working late nights as an office manager, by clipping coupons, by stretching meals so that no one noticed how tight things were. I told myself that was what marriage meant: one partner dreams, the other anchors. But sometimes an anchor isn't grounding, it's sinking. It was a Tuesday morning, early spring. The children had left for school, and I sat with my coffee at the kitchen counter, flipping through the bank statement that had arrived in the mail. I wasn't in the habit of opening them. Mark usually kept those tucked away in his study, but that morning curiosity got the better of me. The envelope lay there unguarded, and I thought, why not? I scanned the list of transactions. Most were familiar: grocery store, utilities, mortgage payment. But then my eyes caught on a line: $425, transfer external account. I frowned. We had no external account that I knew of. "Mark," I asked casually that evening, "what was that transfer for?" $425 to an outside account. He barely looked up from his laptop. "Just business. I had to cover something for a client. Don't worry about it." There it was again, "don't worry," so I didn't. Not out loud, at least. But inside, a seed of unease took root. Over the weeks that followed, I began paying closer attention. I checked the online banking more often, telling myself it was harmless curiosity. That's when I noticed the pattern. Every month, sometimes twice, there were transfers. Not large enough to draw attention, but steady. 400 here, 600 there, sometimes a neat 1,000. When I asked again, Mark's explanations were vague. "Just moving funds around," he said once. "It's for an investment," he said another time. But he never provided details. The accountant in me, the woman who once dreamed of helping other women with finances, felt alarm bells ringing. Numbers don't lie. They don't vanish into thin air. They always have a destination. And yet Mark acted as though I had no right to ask. I didn't tell anyone. Not my sister, not my closest friend, not even Emily, who by then was in her first year of college. I told myself that marriage was private, that loyalty meant protecting his image, even from suspicion. But silence is heavy. It grows heavier each day you carry it. At night, lying next to him, I would wonder, who are you really? Where is our money going? And why do you look at me as if I'm the one intruding when all I want is honesty? There were moments when I nearly confronted him. Times when my voice rose in my throat, ready to say, "Enough, show me the truth." But each time I swallowed it back, because I wasn't ready. Because I was afraid of what the truth might cost. Life went on. That's the strange thing about betrayal in its earliest form. It hides in plain sight, even as birthdays are celebrated, even as family dinners are shared. Mark still kissed my cheek before bed. We still hosted neighbors for barbecues. From the outside, nothing had changed, but I noticed the little cracks. He guarded his phone more closely. He spent longer nights at the office. His laughter, once easy and open, now carried a sharpness, like a man rehearsing joy instead of feeling it. And always the bank statements. Always the quiet siphoning of money from a future I thought we were building together. The moment of clarity came not in a dramatic fight, but in the stillness of another morning. I sat with my coffee, the spring sun warm on my face, and opened the newest statement. There it was again, $975 transferred. Same external account. But this time, something inside me shifted. I thought of Emily's tuition bill, of Jacob's braces, of the years I had worked extra shifts, the dreams I had folded away like old letters in a drawer. And I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about trust. It was about the invisible contract of marriage, the one that says, I will not betray you in the small, hidden places where you may never think to look. Mark had broken that contract, and while I wasn't ready to expose him yet, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would no longer be silent. I would no longer be silent. That decision didn't arrive like a trumpet or a slammed door. It settled over me the way morning light settles into a room, gently but with a stubborn insistence that refuses to be ignored. I rinsed my coffee mug and set it on the drying rack, then pulled a yellow legal pad from the junk drawer and wrote a date at the top. Under it, a heading in block letters, Transfers External Account. The first line I recorded was the most recent, $975, the one that had tipped something inside me from uneasy to resolute. Then I turned to the stack of old statements in the file bin beside our desk and began leafing back through months. The pattern revealed itself like a watermark blooming on paper under heat. $425, $600, $750, $1000. The amounts varied. The label didn't. External account. As if the bank itself was conspiring to speak in whispers. When I was done, there were 11 entries on the page and a smudge of ink on the side of my hand. I could feel a life I had barely let myself dream of, one where I asked questions without apology, where I told my own truth without measuring his reaction, pressing forward from the edges. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not Catherine, my sister, who would have told me to wake him in the middle of the night and demand answers. Not Nina from the office, who would have offered the number of her cousin's divorce lawyer before I finished the sentence. Not even Emily home for the long weekend, her duffel bag dropped where Emily always dropped it, just inside the door as if she were still 14 and late for soccer. Mom, she called. Did you move the cinnamon? I'm teaching Dad how to make French toast that isn't a crime. In the drawer by the stove, I said, closing the file drawer with my hip and bringing my face into a smile before she reached the kitchen. You're still enabling his kitchen confidence, I see. He's very proud of his one pan, she said, rolling her eyes with fondness. We should hold a ceremony. I watched her crack eggs into a bowl, a woman now, not the serious little girl who used to line up her dolls and read them library books. Mark breezed in a moment later, hair damp from a shower and clean-shaven, a small domestic grace that time had taught me not to take for granted. He kissed Emily's head, then the corner of my mouth, his usual choreography. If there was guilt in him, it was well-trained. How's my favorite house? He said, which was what he said to the kitchen when he was in a good mood. Sturdy as ever, I said, and the part of me that had once believed that house as a stand-in for marriage, solid on its foundation, cracked a little more. He flipped a slice of French toast with theatrical flair and glanced at the clock. I'm stopping by Lockridge after breakfast, he said. They've got a contractor I want to meet. Lockridge? I asked, keeping my tone mild. The development off Lakeview, he said. They've got this clean modern thing going, big glass white oak, minimalist but not cold. He said it the way men say it when they're reaching for a future they haven't asked anyone else to share. Sounds pretty, Emily said, as if commenting on a sweater in a shop window. Just scouting, he added quickly. You know, ideas. I reached for plates. Of course, I said. Then I stored the word Lockridge next to external account in a new, precise part of my brain that had begun to build shelves for such things. That afternoon, while Mark was scouting, I looked through the file cabinet again. Marriage is a lot of paperwork when you put it in one place. Tax returns, the settlement statement from when we'd bought this house, Emily's FAFSA, Jacob's immunization records, warranties for appliances that had long since died. Their promises expired with a shrug. I found the original deed and the mortgage note. Joint tenants with rights of survivorship. We had signed our names in a room with a ficus and a bowl of lemon candies the day the sellers handed us a single brass key. I had been 8 months pregnant with Jacob then, and most of what I remember is the pinched expression of the notary as I shifted in the chair, and the way Mark squeezed my knee under the table. I remember the feeling that we were a unit, a word the loan officer used that made us sound like a quarterback and a tight end instead of a man and a woman about to share a bathroom for the rest of their lives. Numbers, documents, names, I made copies. I slid them into plastic sleeves and then into a plain black binder that didn't announce itself. I dug out a thumb drive and scanned what I could. I told myself I was simply organizing, the way women organize the pantry or the calendar, the way we hold unglamorous things together with quiet competence no one writes songs about. But when I tucked the binder into the back of my closet behind a stack of sweaters, I felt the small thrill a child feels when she hides a secret in a hollow tree. The next week, I called the bank while Mark was at a breakfast meeting. "Good morning," I said, adopting the crisp tone I'd used years ago when I answered phones at the marketing firm. "I'd like to ask a question about some transfers from our joint account." "Of course," the woman on the other end said. "Can you verify your information?" I gave her the numbers. I listened to the tapping of keys, the neutral courtesy. "These transfers labeled as external account, do you have any more detail? Who holds that account?" "I can see the routing and account numbers they go to," she said carefully. "But I'm not able to disclose another customer's information." "Is it a personal checking?" I asked. "A brokerage, an LLC?" "I can't tell you specifically," she said. "But in general, transfers coded this way usually go to a brokerage or business account." "Is there any way to set an alert when these occur?" She hesitated. "We can set email alerts on activity over a certain threshold." "Set one for any transfer over $300, I said, picturing the list on my yellow pad. "And can you email me statements going back 18 months? She promised she would. After we hung up, I wrote alerts on the legal pad and underlined it. I could feel my life acquiring labels where before there had only been trust. That evening when Mark came home, he was buoyant. "You won't believe the lots at Lockridge," he said, exaggerated awe that he reserved for football games and the occasional summer thunderstorm. "Clean lines, no wasted space. They've got a model house with this floating staircase, didn't even look possible. It's like," he paused, searching for the word. "Effortless." "Effortless," I repeated and walked my fingers up his forearm like someone climbing. "Sounds expensive." "Surprisingly reasonable, actually," he said. "They've got a builder's special right now, and the biggest cost is land which they acquired when the market was softer. We should just sit with a planner, see what's possible." I said lightly. He grinned, not hearing what I had tucked into the word. "We." The morning after our Lockridge meeting, sunlight streamed into the kitchen as if the world were determined to act as though nothing had changed. And perhaps to everyone else in my family, nothing had. Mark sipped his coffee, scrolling through his phone with the absent-minded rhythm of a man convinced the world will always bend to his plans. But for me, everything had shifted. The words the lawyer had spoken, spousal waiver possible, kept circling in my head like a hawk over a field. It wasn't just a phrase, it was a confirmation. Confirmation that there were doors Mark could try to close, papers he could try to sign without me, futures he could try to script where my name never appeared. And now I had language. Now I had proof that those doors could be locked or unlocked depending on who held the pen. When the kids left for school and Mark headed to work, I returned to my yellow legal pad. My ledger of secrets. I added new entries. Lockridge meeting confirmed spousal waiver clause. Apex Meridian paperwork flimsy, high risk, no audited statements. Daniel Pierce equals principal contact. Each line was like a bead strung onto a necklace. On their own, they were just small, shining facts. But together, they were becoming an ornament of truth I would one day wear around Mark's neck until he choked on it. That afternoon, I checked the mailbox at the UPS store. Inside was a thick envelope from the bank with 18 months of statements. I carried it out as though it were a newborn, fragile, precious, dangerous to drop. At home, I spread the statements across the dining room table. Transfers leapt out at me like bruises on pale skin. $425, $600, $1,000, $850. The amounts varied, but the pattern was steady. I pulled out my calculator and tallied. The total over 18 months was more than $18,000. $18,000. Enough to pay a year of college tuition, enough to replace the roof, enough to cover every late-night overtime hour I had worked for the past 5 years. He hadn't just been careless, he had been deliberate. I took a photo of the table, every statement laid out like evidence at trial, and saved it to the secure folder on my laptop. Then I slid each statement into a plastic sleeve one by one until the binder was thick with truth. That weekend, Mark suggested dinner out, just the two of us. "We haven't done that in ages," he said, and his smile was warm, rehearsed, hopeful. We went to an Italian place downtown, the kind with soft lighting and wine bottles stacked like trophies against brick walls. We ordered bruschetta and a bottle of Chianti. From the outside, we must have looked like a couple celebrating nothing more complicated than another year together. But inside me, something had hardened. "So," he said, swirling his wine, "you were impressive with the lawyer the other day." He said most spouses don't ask half the questions you did. "I like to know what I'm signing," I said. "You've always trusted me," he said as if it were a compliment. I met his gaze across the candle. "Trust isn't the same as ignorance, Mark." He blinked, his expression flickering just a little before settling back into charm. "Of course not. I just mean you've always let me take the lead. That's what makes us work." I cut into my chicken marsala slowly, letting the silence stretch. Once, I would have rushed to reassure him to smooth the edges. But now I let the silence speak for me. On Sunday evening, Emily came home unexpectedly. "Just needed a break from campus food," she said, setting her backpack by the door. I was stirring a pot of chili when she joined me at the stove. "You okay, Mom?" she asked. "Of course," I said. "You seem different." She studied me with the sharp eyes of a daughter who had grown up watching me bend and accommodate, soften and swallow words. She was noticing now the subtle stiffening of my spine. "Different isn't always bad," I said, smiling as I handed her the wooden spoon. Her gaze lingered, but she didn't push. Still, I wondered how much children sense even when we think we're hiding things well. 2 days later, Mark's brother Aaron stopped by. He leaned in the doorway of the kitchen with the loose comfort of someone who had grown up in our house almost as much as his own. "You know he's excited, right?" Aaron said casually, nodding toward Mark's study. "The house, the investment stuff. He talks about it like it's his ticket to finally proving himself." "Proving himself to who?" I asked. Aaron shrugged. "Maybe Dad, maybe himself. He's always been chasing that big win." I kept my face calm, but inside, Aaron's words landed hard. Chasing that big win, the very chase that had drained $18,000 from our joint account. The very chase that threatened to pull us all under. "Just keep your eyes open," Aaron added, softer now. "I know my brother, he's charming, but he doesn't always think long-term." I wanted to laugh at the understatement, but instead I simply nodded. "Thanks, Aaron, I'll keep that in mind." Each night after the house went quiet, I built my case. I documented every transfer, every inconsistency, every vague answer Mark gave. I kept a journal, writing not just the facts but his words, his expressions, the shifts in his tone. I spoke again with Lena, the lawyer. "You're doing exactly what you should," she said. "Documentation is power. Don't confront him yet. Let him think you're still in the dark." "I can do that," I said, and I could. Silence had been my practice for years, but now it wasn't silence born of fear, it was silence sharpened into strategy. The next family dinner came sooner than I expected. Catherine invited us all over for her husband's birthday. The house was loud, filled with cousins and cake and the clatter of too many people in one kitchen. But at one point, as we sat at the long dining table, Mark raised a glass of wine and said, "To new beginnings." It was a simple phrase meant for his brother-in-law's birthday, but when he looked at me as he said it, I felt the weight of another meaning. I smiled back, polite and unreadable. Let the room believe I toasted along. Let him believe his secrets were still safe. But inside, I tightened my grip on the stem of my glass because I knew the cracks were widening. I knew the time for silence was drawing to a close. And I knew that when the truth finally came to light, it wouldn't be in whispers, it would be in thunder. I used to think silence was weakness, that the woman who didn't speak up was the woman who was destined to be ignored. But silence, I was learning, could be a blade. In the right hands with the right timing, it could cut deeper than any scream. After that family dinner at Catherine's, after Mark lifted his glass and toasted to new beginnings, I knew I couldn't just stand in the shadows of his choices anymore. If he wanted new beginnings, then so would I. The difference was that mine would not be written on borrowed checks or brokers' promises. Mine would be inked in evidence, stamped in law, carved into permanence. The following Monday, I met Lena Rocha in her office. Her space was nothing like the gleaming Lockridge conference room. It was warm and worn, shelves crowded with law books, photos of her nieces and nephews, a mug with lipstick stains. But it felt real. It felt like the kind of place where women crawled in broken and stood up whole. She slid a legal pad across the desk. At the top, written in her careful block letters, was a list. Copies of joint account statements, heavy check mark. Documentation of transfers, heavy check mark. Record of spousal assets, retirement accounts, investments, deeds, will, trust, any existing estate plans. Proof of extraneous spending, gifts, dinners, receipts, witnesses, or corroboration. You're doing well, she said, tapping the check marks beside the first two. But we need to deepen the paper trail. Right now you've got smoke, we want fire. How do I get that? I asked. Watch his spending, photograph receipts. If he buys jewelry, snap the receipt. If he takes money out in cash, note the time. If he says he's working late, jot it down. Everything builds the case. I nodded, sliding the pad into my bag. Most important, she said, lowering her voice, don't confront him yet. Let him walk into the trap thinking he's free. People reveal the most when they think no one's listening. That night, I bought a small black moleskine notebook. On the first page, I wrote in neat cursive observations. I became a collector of shadows. Tuesday, 8:15 p.m. Mark said he was working late. Car not in driveway until 11:47. Thursday, 2:10 p.m. Transfer alert from bank $650. Friday, 6:30 p.m. Dinner receipt from Riverstone Grill, 2 entrees, bottle of wine, tip generous. He told me he had a quick bite at the office. The notebook grew like ivy. Each line was a root digging deeper into the truth. One evening, Emily stopped by after her internship. She lingered in the kitchen, watching me as I chopped onions. Mom, she said finally, are you and Dad okay? I forced a small laugh. Why do you ask? You've been different, stronger. It's like you're holding something back. Her words pierced me. For years she had seen me soften, defer, smooth things over. She had learned, as daughters do, how to read the weather in her mother's eyes. We're fine, I said. Marriage just has seasons. Some are bright, some are stormy. She studied me a long moment, then nodded. Just promise me one thing, if you're ever in a storm, you don't have to stand in the rain alone. I hugged her tightly, my throat tight with words I couldn't say. The proof I needed came unexpectedly. A week later, Catherine called. You'll never guess who I saw at Riverstone last night, she said. Her voice hushed with the thrill of gossip. Who? Mark, with some woman, not a client unless he's suddenly consulting for 30-year-old blondes in red dresses. I froze. Did he see you? No, but I saw him. He looked comfortable. Did you get a picture? Of course I did, she said. I wasn't born yesterday. The photo arrived by text within seconds. Mark leaning across the table, his hand close to hers, their wine glasses nearly touching. The woman laughed, head tipped back. The intimacy of people who thought the world wasn't watching. I forwarded the image to my secure folder. Then I slipped my phone into my pocket and stirred the pot of soup simmering on the stove. From the outside, nothing had changed, but inside, everything had. The following Saturday, Mark fell asleep on the couch, his phone slipping from his hand. For years, I would never have dreamed of looking, but years of silence had taught me the cost of not looking. I picked it up. No password, careless or confident, I scrolled. Text messages from Daniel Pierce full of promises. The flip will triple in 6 months. Don't tell anyone until we close. Then others from a number labeled S. Last night was perfect. I can't wait until you're free of all this. Lockridge will be ours, ours. I took photos of the messages with my own phone. Each one slid neatly into the growing binder of Betrayal. The next day, we hosted Sunday lunch for his parents. Mark carved the roast with practiced charm, pouring wine, making jokes. He was the picture of stability, the devoted son, the cheerful husband. And I smiled, passed the potatoes, laughed in the right places. I let him perform, let him believe the mask was still intact. But behind my polite smile, I counted the hours until I could slip back to my closet, slide those new photos into the binder, and feel the weight of my case grow heavier in my hands. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Lena's list. Proof of spending, check. Witness corroboration, check. Receipts, texts, photos, check. I had enough to confront him, enough to blow it all open. But I didn't, not yet, because Lena's voice rang in my ears. People reveal the most when they think no one's listening. Mark still believed he was winning. Still believed his new beginnings were his to claim. And I wanted him to walk all the way to the edge of that cliff before I pushed. I circled the date on my calendar. The Lockridge contract signing. The day he thought he would cement our future without me. That would be the day. Until then, I would wait. I would watch. I would gather every crumb of truth until it became a feast no one could ignore. Silence, once my prison, had become my weapon. And when the time came to use it, the sound of it breaking would echo louder than thunder. The calendar became my metronome. Every morning I would look at the red circle I'd drawn around Wednesday, Lockridge signing, and count the days left like a prisoner scratching lines into stone. 6 days. 5. 4. Each tick of time brought Mark closer to the edge he didn't even know he was walking. Monday, the play of normalcy. Mark kissed me goodbye with the same easy confidence of a man leaving for another day at the office. His briefcase was heavier than usual, stuffed with contracts and optimism. He looked proud, the way boys look when they've hidden a secret fort in the woods and are sure no one has found it. "Dinner at 6, he asked. "Dinner at 6, I agreed, my voice even warm, the voice of a wife who still played her part. When the door closed, I exhaled the breath I'd been holding. I set my coffee mug down, opened the binder, and reviewed the arsenal inside. Statements, receipts, photos, texts. Each page was a brick. Together they built a fortress. Tuesday, whispers in windows. Emily called on her lunch break. "Mom, Dad's been texting me about Lockridge. He says I'll love the place when I see it. Are you two planning something big?" I kept my tone soft. "Sometimes your father likes to dream ahead of reality." She was quiet for a beat, then, "I don't know why, but it makes me nervous. He's talking like it's already ours." I gripped the phone tighter. "Trust your instincts, sweetheart. They're sharper than you realize." "Yours too," she replied. "I can hear it in your voice." After we hung up, I stared out the kitchen window. The late afternoon sun painted the grass gold, but I felt the shadow of what was coming creep longer across our home. Wednesday, the brothers' warning. Aaron stopped by unannounced, smelling faintly of motor oil and honesty. He leaned against the counter while I brewed tea. "Look," he said, lowering his voice. "I don't know all the details, but Mark's been talking big, too big, like he's about to make a move that doesn't have a safety net." I set the mugs down between us. "You've always known your brother chases wins." "Yeah, but this one feels different, like he's betting the farm. He thinks he's untouchable." Aaron paused. "Don't let him drag you down with him." I met his eyes, steady, unflinching. "I won't." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "Good, because I think you're stronger than he realizes." Thursday, the mother-in-law. That evening, Mark's parents joined us for dinner. My mother-in-law, always precise, always polite, helped me set the table. As she laid down forks, she said quietly, "He reminds me of his father at that age. Always sure the next gamble would be the one that paid off." I glanced at her. "And did it?" She shook her head, lips pressed thin. "No, it didn't. And I learned the hard way to keep my own account. My own name on the title. You should too." Her words were both confession and warning. I tucked them into the binder in my mind next to all the others. Friday, the daughters' resolve. Emily came home for the weekend. She sat on my bed while I folded laundry, her hair spilling loose around her shoulders. "Mom," she said, "if something happens between you and Dad, I want you to know I'm with you." My hand stilled on a towel. "You don't have to choose sides." "I already have," she whispered. "Not against him, for you, for truth." I reached for her hand, my throat thick. "Then remember this, Emily, strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits, sometimes it prepares. Saturday, the quiet before, Mark spent most of the day in his study, papers spread, phone calls whispered. When he emerged for dinner, his eyes were alight with a fire I hadn't seen in years. "We're close," he said, almost giddy. "Closer than ever." I smiled, polite. "That's wonderful." Inside, my pulse beat with another rhythm, closer than ever to the end. Sunday, the family table, we hosted Aaron, Catherine, and the kids. The house was full of laughter, but under it all I felt the ground shifting. At one point, Aaron caught my eye across the room. He gave the smallest nod as if to say, "I trust you've got this." I did. Monday, the last piece. The bank alert came just after noon. $1. 200 transferred. The largest yet. The note read, "Lockridge Escrow Prep." I printed the alert, slid it into the binder, and closed it with finality. The case was airtight now. That evening Mark kissed me longer than usual, almost tenderly. Perhaps he felt the pull of history, the weight of years. Perhaps he mistook my silence for devotion. I let him, because sometimes silence is not consent. Sometimes silence is the drumbeat of inevitability. Tuesday, the eve. The night before the signing, I stood at the window long after Mark had gone to bed. The moonlight silvered the lawn and the house seemed to hold its breath. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tomorrow, the mask would drop. Tomorrow, the silence would end. And when it did, it would not be a whisper. It would be the sound of thunder tearing through a storm. The morning of the signing began like any other. Coffee, toast, Mark humming under his breath as he ironed his shirt, the same tune he used to hum before job interviews or big presentations. Confidence, anticipation. To him, this was the beginning of his victory lap. To me, it was the end of his illusion. We drove in near silence. Mark tapped his fingers on the steering wheel to some song only he could hear. Every so often, he'd glance at me, smile, as if he were sharing a secret. "You'll see," he said once. "This is going to be the start of something incredible for us." I turned my face toward the window, watching the city blur past. "For us," he said. The words tasted hollow. In the binder on my lap, hidden in a plain leather tote, lay every statement, every receipt, every photo, my quiet army. Lockridge's offices were designed to impress. Glass walls, pale wood floors. The faint scent of eucalyptus pumped through the vents. A receptionist with perfect hair led us to a conference room where a lawyer waited with a stack of papers thick enough to rebuild a house. Mark shook hands, cheerful, practiced. "We're excited to move forward," he said. The lawyer smiled politely. "Of course. Let's go through the documents step by step." We sat. Mark leaned forward, eager, as the lawyer began explaining escrow accounts, inspection contingencies, deed transfers. It was a performance, and Mark loved nothing more than feeling like the lead actor on stage. I let him have his moment. "Now," the lawyer said, sliding a form toward us, "we'll need signatures from both spouses on the deed. Unless, of course, one spouse intends to waive their rights. That would require a spousal waiver." He said it casually, as though it were just another line item. But the air shifted. Mark laughed, waving a hand. "We're not worried about that. This is a team effort." The lawyer nodded. "Good, then both signatures will be required here, here, and here." Mark reached for the pen. That was the moment I opened my tote and laid the binder on the table. The sound of the binder hitting wood was sharper than I expected. Mark froze, pen in hand. "What's this?" he asked, trying to laugh, though his eyes flickered. "Something for you to look at before you sign," I said calmly, my voice steady, measured. I opened the binder and began sliding pages across the table. Bank statements with highlighted transfers. Receipts from dinners he hadn't had with me. Photos, Catherine's picture at the restaurant, the text messages from S. Each page another nail in the coffin of his lies. Mark's face drained of color. "What the hell is this?" he demanded. The lawyer glanced between us, uneasy. "Perhaps, keep going," I said, eyes on Mark. "You've been moving money out of our joint account for 18 months, I said. "Over $18,000. You told me we needed to tighten our belts while you were buying wine and jewelry for someone else." "That's not," he began. I slid another page across. "And here are the texts, plans for a new life with her." His hand shook. "You went through my phone, you left it unlocked," I said simply. "And Georgia is a one-party consent state. That recording of you bragging to Daniel Pierce about how I trust you completely. That's admissible too. The lawyer coughed discreetly, shifting in his chair. Mark's voice rose. This isn't the place for this. Oh, I think it's exactly the place, I replied. I leaned forward, my voice soft but cutting. Because you were about to sign a contract that would bind me to your mess, and I won't allow that. Remember the prenup you insisted on 28 years ago? I asked. The one with the fidelity clause you thought had expired. His mouth opened, then shut. It hasn't. Section 12, still valid, still binding, which means everything you've tried to build outside this marriage, every dollar you funneled away, every lie you told, will cost you far more than you ever imagined. The lawyer cleared his throat. Mr. Caldwell, she's correct. This clause would hold in court. Mark sagged back in his chair as though the air had been punched from his lungs. I closed the binder gently. You will sign this purchase contract, I said, but not with your name alone. If this house is bought, it will be mine. In my name only, or there will be no deal at all. The lawyer nodded, already reaching for the alternate spousal waiver form. That can be arranged. Mark's eyes burned into mine. You can't do this to me. I held his gaze steady as stone. You already did this to yourself. For the first time in months, I felt the silence lift. No longer a weight pressing me down, but a storm released. The lawyer slid the form across. I signed my name with a flourish. Mark stared at the pen, then at me. His hand trembled as he scrawled his signature beneath mine, the sound of the pen scratching paper louder than any scream. When it was done, I closed the binder, slipped it back into my tote, and rose. Thank you, I told the lawyer. We're finished here. I walked out of that glass room with my head high, the echo of my heels on the polished floor ringing like victory bells. Behind me, Mark's voice cracked, frantic, calling my name. But I didn't turn back. The silence in the car on the way home was thick enough to choke on. Mark drove with his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the road as though if he didn't blink, he could hold the world together. I sat beside him, my tote at my feet, the binder resting safely inside. My weapon had been unsheathed, and now it hummed with quiet power. Neither of us spoke, not until the house came into view. As soon as the door closed behind us, he spun on me. How dare you, he hissed, his voice cracking with rage. You humiliated me in front of a lawyer, you've ruined everything. No, Mark, I said calmly, setting my bag on the counter. You ruined everything. I simply put the pieces where they belong. His face turned red. I've given you 28 years. I built this life for you, for the kids. I cut him off. You built lies, Mark, and you expected me to live inside them quietly. That's not a life, that's a prison. For a moment he looked as though he might explode, but then his shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He pressed a hand to his forehead. You don't understand, he muttered. I had to do it. I had to prove I wasn't a failure. I almost pitied him then, almost, but pity is not the same as forgiveness. That evening, Emily came by unexpectedly. She walked in with a smile, but it faltered when she saw our faces. What's going on? She asked, setting her bag down. Mark forced a laugh, brittle as glass. Nothing, sweetheart, just a disagreement. Emily looked at me, then at him. That's not nothing. I met her gaze steadily. Your father and I have things to discuss, things you'll need to know soon. Mark snapped, don't drag her into this. Emily's voice rose, sharper than I'd ever heard it. You already did, Dad, when you told me we couldn't afford my textbooks. When Mom worked extra hours while you... She stopped, her voice trembling. I've felt it for months, something wasn't right. Mark turned away, unable to meet her eyes. The next day Aaron stopped by. He found Mark in the driveway, pacing, muttering into his phone. Everything all right? Aaron asked cautiously. Mark shoved the phone into his pocket. She's destroying me, he spat. Your sister-in-law is tearing this family apart. Aaron raised an eyebrow. Funny. From what I hear, you did that yourself. Mark froze. She told you. Aaron shook his head. She didn't have to. I've watched you. I've listened, and I warned you. You never could see past your own ego. Inside, I listened from the window unseen, and for the first time I felt the shift, the alliances tilting, the story reshaping. That evening the phone rang. It was my mother-in-law. Her voice was calm, steady, carrying decades of quiet wisdom. I don't know all the details, she said softly, but I know my son, and I know you. If you've finally drawn a line, then you're right to do so. I didn't once, and I paid the price. Tears stung my eyes. Thank you, I whispered. Stand tall, she said. Don't let him drag you down. By Thursday, Mark was unraveling. He stormed in and out of rooms, making calls, slamming doors. He begged one moment, threatened the next. "You'll regret this," he said, eyes wild. "The kids will hate you. The family will blame you. You'll end up alone." I stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "No, Mark, they see you now, and they see me. And for the first time, they know the difference." His phone buzzed. Cassandra, no doubt. I watched his face fall as he read whatever message she had sent. Perhaps she was already slipping away, realizing the gold she'd been promised was fool's gold after all. That weekend, Emily stayed with me. She followed me into the kitchen, helped chop vegetables, hovered as though she feared I might break. "Mom," she said finally, "I'm proud of you." I set the knife down, my hands trembling. "You could have exploded at him months ago, but you waited. You built your case. You showed strength I didn't even know existed. That's the kind of woman I want to be." I pulled her close, my throat tight. "Then you'll already be better than I ever was. You won't waste years waiting for permission to be strong." By Sunday night, the facade had crumbled. Mark sat in the living room, shoulders slumped, hair disheveled, staring at the floor. "Everyone's turning against me," he muttered. "My own brother, my own daughter, even my mother." "It's not them turning against you," I said quietly. "It's the truth turning toward you. You just don't like the reflection." He looked up at me, eyes red. "So what now?" I met his gaze steadily. "Now we move forward, but not together. Not in the way you thought. You will face the consequences of your choices, and I will rebuild from the ruins you left." That week, word spread. Friends called, some offering support, some digging for gossip. I kept my answers simple. "Mark and I are separating. These things happen." But behind the calm tone was a truth I savored. The mask he had worn so proudly had shattered. And no matter how he tried, he could never put it back together. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, I slept soundly. Not because everything was fixed, far from it, but because the silence I had carried was gone. The storm had broken, and I was still standing. The courthouse was an old building, stone walls weathered by decades of storms, both literal and human. As I walked up the steps that Tuesday morning, I thought of all the women who had walked them before me, wives, mothers, daughters, each carrying their own story of betrayal and resolve. I was not the first, and I would not be the last. But this was my day. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. Mark sat across the hall with a lawyer so young he looked barely older than Jacob. His tie was crooked, his eyes darted nervously at the stack of documents he clutched. Lena sat beside me, calm as ever. She had chosen a navy suit and carried only a slim folder. She didn't need to pile the table high with paper. She had the truth, and that was weight enough. "You're ready," she whispered. I nodded, though my stomach churned. Ready wasn't the word. Determined was better. The judge was a woman in her 60s, silver hair cropped short, eyes sharp behind rimless glasses. She looked over the docket, then over us. There was no softness in her gaze, no patience for games. "Caldwell versus Caldwell," she announced. "Preliminary hearing." We rose, my knees wobbled, but my spine stayed straight. Mark's lawyer stammered through an opening: financial misunderstandings, minor discrepancies, a marriage strained by miscommunication. His voice shook like a boy reading a report he didn't believe. Lena stood next, smooth as silk. "Your Honor, what we have here is not miscommunication. It is systematic financial deception." She laid out the binder page by page, each transfer marked, each receipt noted, each photo placed gently on the record. The texts, the recordings, the prenup clause, all woven into a tapestry that painted Mark not as careless but calculated. The judge's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Caldwell, do you contest these documents?" Mark's voice cracked. "They're taken out of context." Lena raised an eyebrow. $18,000 is difficult to misunderstand. The judge flipped through the prenup, pausing at section 12. She read aloud, her voice steady. "In the event of marital dissolution caused by infidelity, the faithful spouse shall retain primary rights to joint property, including the marital home and shared investments." She looked up. "Mr. Caldwell, you signed this." Mark's face flushed. "It was decades ago. It doesn't." "It does," the judge interrupted sharply. "The language is clear. It applies for the duration of the marriage. You may wish it didn't, but wishing doesn't rewrite contracts." After an hour of testimony, the judge set down her pen. I am ordering the immediate freeze of all joint accounts pending full discovery. Mrs. Caldwell will retain possession of the marital home until proceedings conclude. Mr. Caldwell will have access only to his personal account for living expenses. We will reconvene in 30 days for a full hearing. The gavel struck, sharp, final. Mark's face turned crimson. He leaned across the table, whispering furiously, "You'll regret this, you're ruining me." I met his eyes calmly. "No, Mark, you ruined yourself. I'm just making sure the world sees it." His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, trying to pull him away, but Mark shook him off, glaring at me with all the fury of a man who had built his castle on sand and watched it wash away in one tide. The sun was blinding as we stepped onto the courthouse steps. Reporters weren't there. It wasn't that kind of case, but friends, neighbors, and family would hear soon enough. Word always spreads, especially when pride falls. Aaron was waiting at the bottom of the steps. He looked at me, then at his brother trailing behind with slumped shoulders. "You did what had to be done," Aaron said softly. He'll never admit it, but he needed to be stopped. Mark shot him a venomous look, but Aaron didn't flinch. Back home, Emily sat at the kitchen table waiting. I told her everything, the ruling, the freeze, the prenup clause. She listened, silent, her hands clasped together. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "So you really have the house, the accounts, for now," I said. "The final ruling comes later, but yes, for now we're safe." She nodded, her eyes bright. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I didn't know you had this kind of fight in you." Neither did I thought, until I had no choice but to find it. The next few days were a blur of slammed doors and raised voices. Mark paced the house like a trapped animal, making calls, cursing into the phone, pleading with Cassandra, arguing with Banks. One night I overheard him shouting, "She's frozen everything. I can't touch the accounts." No, I didn't think she'd fight back. She never fights back. I smiled faintly in the dark. He had built his whole scheme on the assumption that I would remain silent. That silence had been his greatest asset. Now it was mine. For years, I had been the woman who smoothed over dinners, who apologized when others raised their voices, who folded her own dreams neatly away like clothes in a drawer. But not anymore. Now I walked taller. I spoke clearer. I began to imagine a future not as someone's wife, not as someone's shadow, but as myself. And for the first time in 28 years, that idea felt less like betrayal and more like freedom. That night, as I locked up the house, I stood for a moment in the doorway, breathing the cool evening air. The battle wasn't over. The war would continue in courtrooms and negotiations, in whispered gossip and slammed phones. But the first victory was mine, and I intended to win the rest. It is a strange thing to wake up in the same house but feel as though you are living a new life. The furniture hadn't changed. The walls hadn't moved. The grandfather clock still chimed the quarter hour in its steady rhythm, but something in me was different. For the first time in decades, I wasn't holding my breath. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was free to imagine tomorrow without the shadow of Mark's decisions hanging over it. The mornings became mine. Coffee in the quiet kitchen. A notebook open on the table, not to track his lies anymore, but to sketch plans. For years, I had dreamed of opening a consultancy, a place where women could come not just for financial advice, but for education. A safe harbor where they could learn how to read the statements, how to ask the right questions, how to never let someone else hold all the keys. Now, with the account secured and Lena's guidance, I began. I rented a small office downtown, 2 rooms above a bakery that smelled of cinnamon rolls every morning. The paint was peeling, the carpet worn, but when I signed the lease, I felt as though I had signed my name to a promise. I will not go back to silence. Word traveled quickly. One afternoon, Aaron stopped by with a smirk. "Guess who moved out of her fancy apartment?" he said. I raised an eyebrow. "Cassandra, packed up and gone. Apparently she discovered that your husband isn't the wealthy genius he made himself out to be. No Lockridge mansion, no hidden millions, just frozen accounts and a reputation in tatters." I allowed myself a small smile. "Illusions don't pay rent." Aaron chuckled. "No, but honesty does, and you've got that in spades." The phone rang often those weeks. Some friends called to offer support, whispering, "I can't believe he did this." Others called for gossip, fishing for details. I kept my answers simple. "Mark and I are separating. These things happen. But the truth was clear: the social circle we had built together was splitting like glass under pressure. Some chose him, unable to believe the charming man they thought they knew could lie so deeply. Others chose me, tired of pretending not to see. And a few disappeared entirely, silenced their own cowardice. I didn't grieve them, not anymore. Emily came often, bringing groceries, helping paint the office walls, her laughter filling spaces that had once echoed with tension. One evening, as we ate takeout on the floor of my new office, she said, "You know what I admire most, Mom? Not that you fought him, but that you're building something after. Most people just survive, you're creating." I looked at her, my heart swelling. "Then learn this lesson: survival is only the first step. What matters is what you do with the life you win back." She nodded, her eyes shining. "I will." Meanwhile, Mark was unraveling. Cassandra gone. The accounts frozen. His business partners whispering, doubting, backing away. He called one night, his voice hoarse. "Bianca, we can fix this. 28 years, it has to mean something." "It does," I said gently. "It means I know exactly who you are, and that's why I can't go back." He begged, he raged. He tried guilt, shame, promises, but the words that once bound me had lost their power. For the first time, I didn't feel small when he raised his voice. I felt tall. My consultancy opened quietly. No ribbon cutting, no champagne. Just a sign on the door: Caldwell Financial Transitions. My first clients were two women in their 40s, both going through divorces, both terrified of what came next. We sat together in that small office with its peeling carpet, and I showed them how to read their statements, how to freeze joint accounts, how to protect themselves. As I spoke, I realized I wasn't just teaching them. I was teaching myself. Every sentence was both instruction and affirmation. "You did this. You survived. You rebuilt." They left with gratitude in their eyes. I stayed behind, tears in mine. One evening, Diana, Mark's sister, stopped by. She hugged me fiercely. "You've done what I always hoped you would," she whispered. "You stopped him, you stopped the pattern." I pulled back, surprised. "You knew." "I suspected for years, but I thought maybe you loved him enough to carry it." "I was wrong to let you." "No," I said softly. "You weren't wrong. We all carry until we can't anymore. I just finally reached the end of mine." One morning, I caught sight of myself in the mirror before leaving for the office. My hair was streaked with silver, my face lined with years of sacrifice, but my eyes were bright again. I hadn't seen that brightness in decades. I touched the glass, whispering, "Welcome back." At the end of the month, the judge's office sent notice. The final hearing was scheduled. Mark would have his last chance to argue. I would have mine to end it. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my tote beside the binder. This time, though, I wasn't nervous. I was ready. That night, as I closed the office and stepped into the cool evening air, I felt it, not the weight of endings, but the lightness of beginnings. From the ashes of betrayal, something new had taken root, and I intended to see it grow. The final hearing fell on what would have been our 29th wedding anniversary. The irony was not lost on me. Once upon a time, we might have celebrated with champagne, a trip, or quiet laughter at home. Now we walked into a courtroom instead, strangers bound not by love but by law. The judge's chambers were cool and formal, her gavel already poised. Lena sat at my side, calm as always, while Mark hunched beside his lawyer, his suit wrinkled, his face drawn. He looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow, as though betrayal itself had hollowed him out. The proceedings were brisk. Lena presented the prenup, the documentation, the trail of transfers. She spoke with precision, each word a nail hammered into a coffin already sealed. Mark's lawyer tried to object, fumbling, but the judge cut him off with weary impatience. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, peering over her glasses, "you signed this document. You violated its terms. There is nothing here for me to reinterpret. The agreement stands." Her gavel fell. "Mrs. Caldwell retains the home, primary retirement accounts, and 70% of joint investments. Mr. Caldwell leaves with his personal possessions and the funds in his private account. Case closed." The echo of wood on wood reverberated through the room, final and absolute. Mark stared at the table, his face pale. Slowly, he turned toward me. "I made a mistake," he whispered. "Is there any chance?" I shook my head gently. "That door is closed, Mark, for good." For the first time, he didn't argue. He only nodded, shoulders slumping in defeat. I rose, smoothed my jacket, and walked out, Lena by my side. The sun outside was dazzling. The air smelled of possibility. 6 months later, Caldwell Financial Transitions was thriving. What began as two women sitting nervously in my office had grown into a steady stream of clients, women finding their footing after loss, betrayal, or sudden change. I had moved from the tiny office above the bakery to a larger space downtown, with 2 associates and a waiting list. My days were full, my work meaningful, my life finally mine. Emily visited often, proud, her eyes shining with a strength that was both hers and mine. Aaron and Diana remained by my side, allies forged in fire. Even my mother-in-law came once with a quiet smile, whispering, "You did what I could not. You broke the cycle." As for Mark, he faded. Cassandra gone, friends gone, money gone. I heard he rented a small apartment and worked part-time for a former colleague. His story no longer belonged to me. When I thought of it all, the binder, the courtroom, the storm, I realized the real victory was never about the money or even the house. It was about reclaiming myself. For years, I had been only someone's wife, someone's mother, someone's shadow. Now I was my own. And from the ruins, I had built something stronger. Dear friends who have listened to my story until the very end, thank you. Stories like mine are not just about betrayal. They are about resilience, dignity, and the quiet power of choosing yourself. If there's one lesson I hope you carry with you, it is this: never give away your voice, your worth, or your independence. Protect your future, protect your family, and above all, protect yourself. Thank you for being here with me through this journey. I wish you health, peace, and happiness for you and for your families. Until next time.